Right. Okay.
Oh, good.
That's us. Okay, comrades. Today's meeting is on the subject of Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland has been in the headlines internationally for on and off over the last 100 and odd years. The last 50 years in particular has been a period of high profile publicity that most countries or most communities wouldn't want. It has been the scene of a virtual civil war. And I don't know the actual figure, it was something around 30,000, more than 30,000 people have been killed. The peace agreement was established about 25 years ago after a lot of negotiations, bringing the various combatants and political masters of the state of the Republic of Ireland and the state of Great Britain into sort of an agreement. The agreement was brokered mainly on an agenda set by capitalism. It was set by the British, it was set by the Irish, and the strings were pulled in the background by the American government. It eventually brought people together, and it brought, first of all, so-called peace, the end of the killings and the end of the bombings. The second thing it did was it established a government, but a government with limitations on it. A government that was created with built-in sectarianism, in that the parties to it came from sectarian background and were guaranteed representation on the basis of their presence as sectarian parties. Labour was absent from the discussions. Labour was absent from the settlement. And Labour has been silent, as Labour has been for the best part of 100 years. Tommy is one, sorry, I wanted to say a special welcome to Tommy McKierney. Tommy is one of the most highly respected commentators on Northern Ireland that we have. Tommy speaks with the authority as a participant from being a very young man who took up the gun to defend his community. The catalyst, as I understand, was the introduction of internment without trial, which was exactly what it says. Internment with, in other words, jailing with no trial, no sentencing, open-ended prison incarceration, and mainly on the communities that lived in those areas defined as Catholic. There were jailings of Protestant paramilitaries as well, but not on the same scale. Tommy went through that period of the war, and as mentioned in the handout, his family paid very heavily. Some of his family were activists as well. 3 of them were either killed in action or murdered, and some relatives, some uncles and aunts were killed as well. Since the settlement, Tommy has broken from the Republican discipline, and he operates now as a socialist, clearly defined socialist. He works with he works to support himself as a journalist, but he also, in his work, is a leading representative of the Independent Workers' Union. The Independent Workers' Union is an organisation that exists north and south of the border. It doesn't recognise any limits, and they set up initially to recognise or to seek recognition and support for unorganised workers, people who were never in unions or people who had fallen out with their unions. And they've been quite successful in not just securing recognition for them, but also including settlements to the advantage of those workers. Tommy has been a tremendous asset to that, in that he brings to it a trade union understanding, an organisation understanding, and a political understanding. And with that, I'm going to hand the meeting over to Tommy and say, welcome. You're very welcome.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you. And thank you to the group here for extending this invitation. From the start, can I just say, in case I start to use local vernacular, maybe just, Jimmy, you or someone flag it up to me. For a start, terminology when we're talking here about Northern Ireland, sometimes we call it the North, a lot of times 6 counties, the North of Ireland. It very often defines one's political outlook, how we use the term for the place. It doesn't really disturb me or annoy me, whatever we call it, but just to be clear in case I slip into the local vernacular. First, contrary to what has often been put out, the conflict in Northern Ireland was not a religious conflict any more than the conflict in Gaza today is a religious conflict between Jew and Arab. Jew and Arab are on either side, but it's not a religious conflict over interpretations of the Holy Quran or the Talmud any more than, so to the same extent, although the casualties in Gaza are infinitely higher, obviously, than they were ever in the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. But the dispute was never over interpretations. It was not something emerging from the Reformation. Originally, what we now know as Northern Ireland was a colonial construction. And it was built in order to protect the British Empire's western flanks. People were brought in from Britain to colonize the northern part of Ireland in order to establish effectively a garrison to protect the western flanks of the empire. And as has happened elsewhere, it was a very deliberate policy of maintaining antagonism between those people who arrived as planters, the plantation of Ulster, sometimes maybe euphemistically called settlers, but we still call them planters. And it was very deliberately done in such a way that there would remain antagonism between the colonial arrivals, plantation, and the native Irish, because otherwise, without that antagonism, there would be the risk that both would unite and break away from the central government in London. Now, that was originally created. The plantation of Ulster happened in the beginning of the 17th century. But what we now call Northern Ireland actually was created in 1922 with very much the same idea in mind, same concept, to garrison Britain's western flank, to have boots on the ground. Now, in order to ensure that there would remain antagonism and between those with a colonial background and those from what might be described as the native Irish, although that's by the beginning of the 20th century, the term native doesn't really apply, since those that were in favour of union with Britain had been living in Ireland for so long that they were certainly could only be described as Irish as well, native Irish. But in order to ensure, and this was colonial policy, imperial policy, to divide, conquer, and rule. There had been a fear that, and a concern that there could be working class unity across between all sections of the working class in Northern Ireland. In 1907, there had been a general strike in Belfast, which was supported by all communities in the city, apart from obviously the bourgeoisie, but from the working class. 1919, same thing happened. 1934, there were what we call the outdoor relief riots. And on each occasion, in order to ensure that there wouldn't be permanent working class unity, what we would call the orange card was used. In other words, divisions were artificially created to ensure that there wouldn't be cross-community working class unity. And in order then to ensure that there would be divisions. What we, broadly speaking, can call the Protestant working class were offered relative privilege. I am emphasizing the word relative. They were not privileged people, they were given relative privilege in the sense of access to employment in the industrial heartland of Belfast. And at one stage, huge industries such as the shipyards, aircraft industry were predominantly staffed by people from within the pro-union or Protestant community. Now, times have moved on, and what was once a prosperous, certainly for capitalism, a prosperous industrial base in Northern Ireland has now, as a result not just of the conflict of the past, but really because of globalization, heavy industry has moved east from Western Europe, actually, never mind Belfast. So what used to be the famous shipyard of Harrington Wolff, at one time employing over 10,000 workers as recently as the late 60s, now has only a sprinkling, couple of hundred workers. And Harrington Wolff is actually practically in receivership at the moment. Now, let me just quote a few statistics, because now Northern Ireland has become probably it is the most deprived region within the United Kingdom. Of the 4 parts of the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland is the most deprived. In terms of the health service, which used to be at one time a feather in the cap, as with, of course, across the United Kingdom, the National Health Service has been undermined, but it's been undermined more so in Northern Ireland than any other part of the United Kingdom. 26% of the Northern Irish population is on a waiting list for the first consultation. Population of less than 2 million. Approximately 545,000 people are waiting for elective care in Northern Ireland, the highest recorded since the database was set up in June 2008. And those are statistics from the BMA, the British Medical Association. That's an astonishing figure, 26% of the entire population waiting for a first consultation. That indicates not just problems in Northern Ireland, but it obviously is indicative of the approach of free market hearing from Britain over the last 40 years since the arrival of the Thatcherite arrival. And housing. On the 31st of March 2024, there were 47,312 households on the social housing waiting list, 75% experiencing housing stress. And the official homeless statistics for Northern Ireland currently stand at 55,000 people, including 4,500 children, and that was on the 11th of June 2024. Now, just to remark that housing, for a period of time, we had a housing executive which provided public housing for the people. Now it has been undermined greatly and its budget reduced, but housing was the issue that effectively sparked the most recent round of troubles in 1968-69, discriminatory allocation of housing, which still remains unaddressed. Pay, just for an example, the starting salary for a teacher in the Republic of Ireland is now approximately €40,000 per annum. The equivalent figure in Northern Ireland is approximately 27,300. Economically, Northern Ireland has the lowest productivity and the highest economic inactivity across the UK and Ireland. In terms of equality, Northern Ireland has an even lower rate of inequality. Rates of poverty in Northern Ireland and Great Britain are significantly higher than those in Ireland. The Northern Ireland Department of Infrastructure includes water and sewage networks, and for those of us living in or near Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Department of Infrastructure is responsible for inland waterways and networks, and it has managed to fail completely to address contamination in Lough Neagh, which is the largest inland lake in the British Isles, actually, and also is supposed to provide water for approximately 50% of the population of Northern Ireland. Probably, and because the Department of Infrastructure is incapable of addressing that, the Lough Neagh has now been contaminated with green algae and different contaminations. Finally, gross national income per capita in the Republic of Ireland is 41% higher than in Northern Ireland, and that was a figure accessed by Dr. Graham Gudgeon in 2024. Graham Gudgeon is a professor of economics in Cambridge University, and not by any manner means noted for a left-wing view. So what we're saying here is that at the moment, the 6 counties of Northern Ireland is not performing well at all economically. There's poverty, there is widespread need, and the health service is failing badly. Now, against that, the trade union movement has been attempting to rectify some of this of late. But let's say one of the problems faced by the trade union movement in Northern Ireland is that for many years, because of the discriminatory nature of employment in Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland, the government of Northern Ireland, which was established in 1922, systemically and consciously discriminated against those that were not supportive of the regime, in other words, the Catholic or nationalist and or Republican communities. They ensured that employment in both the private and public sectors was heavily biased towards their supporters within the Protestant working class in order to ensure the loyalty of the Protestant working class. So because of the fact that, for example, most of the industrial base in Northern Ireland was heavily dependent for many years on state subsidy, the state could direct who would be employed effectively. And as a result of that, trade unionism, especially the industrial trade unions in Northern Ireland, did not really have a huge representation from within the Catholic community, apart from post the introduction of the welfare state in the late 40s. The Catholic population started to find itself in public sector unions. So the trade union movement has been underrepresented in the nationalist or Catholic communities in Northern Ireland until very recently. And this is something that I'll talk about later, because capitalism has identified the fact that many unions are underrepresented in what would be described as nationalist or Republican areas and working class communities, and has exploited that by developing a presence, industrial presence outside of Belfast and in nationalist or Republican areas where there has been a lack of representation. But contrary to that, now let me just clarify something. In January of this year, there was a very significant uptake of trade union activity. Tens of thousands of workers from 16 different unions were part of a mass walkout. Teachers, nurses, civil servants, bus drivers, train drivers, and many others took to the picket lines. And the unions, let me just run through the list of unions, because it's surprising the number of unions that were involved in that massive walkout. There was the British Dietetic Association, Chartered Society of Physiotherapists, the GMB, Irish National Teachers Organisation, Society of Radiographers, SIP2, National Association of Head Teachers, National Association of School Teachers, National Education Union, NIPSA, Royal College of Midwives, Royal College of Nursing, Ulster Teachers Union, Unison, Unite, and University and Colleges Union. Now, the fact is that when you hear of all that, you're talking strictly a lot of public sector, practically all of public sector unions, and where you're talking about unions such as Unite, NIPSA, or SIP2. It was their members of those unions within the public sector. Now, this was a very extensive piece of industrial action, probably a much more militant response to pay and lack of pay and discriminatory application of pay between Northern Ireland and the rest of Britain, but is a much more militant response than there was in anything south of the border in the Republic of Ireland. Although the two Irish Congress of Trade Unions represents entire unions across the island. Now, it wasn't a general strike as such, but it indicates that there is considerable militancy, particularly within the public sector unions. Private sector unions are not as militant for the simple reason they don't have the same industrial muscle, because the industry in Northern Ireland is not in as powerful position as it used to be. And as I said to you earlier, capital has taken the position to move into what we, broadly speaking, call west of the band, which is usually more nationalist and or Republican than unionist. And because of the history of the discriminatory practices, trade unionism in the industrial sector has not been as strong in those areas because they were so unfamiliar with employment in that sector. And capitalism has now taken advantage of that. And there's a number of engineering companies, medium-sized engineering companies in those areas which are totally unorganized, which is a challenge to union organizers. Now, that's broadly speaking. I don't want to go back to that if need be, to the position of the unions. But the administration in Northern Ireland, that's since the Good Friday Agreement has been set up, the administration has been, if you like, in a state of on-off crisis. Since it was established with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, it has collapsed. As the local devolved parliament, local devolved government has collapsed 6 times since the Good Friday Agreement was established, 30% of its lifespan. Partly because it has arisen out of the nature of the Good Friday Agreement and its attempt to settle. The Good Friday Agreement effectively brought an end to armed conflict, but really did not address the needs of Northern Irish society. The Stormont Assembly, which is a local government, has no fiscal authority. It's constantly foiled by what's known as the petition of concern. Petition of concern means that because of the nature of the Good Friday Agreement, which introduced mandatory power sharing, and in an attempt to ensure that there wouldn't be an attempt to ensure that there'd be some fair play, which has meant that if an issue arises that concerns one side or the other, that they can issue a petition of concern, which means that an attempt to legislate is stalled. But as the chair referred to at the start, the Good Friday Agreement was based on a sectarian division of power. So before entering the Assembly, elected members have to declare their position, whether they're nationalist, unionist, or other. Now, that means that for the bulk of members going in, they declare their position is either nationalist and or unionist. So if a certain percentage of one of the other positions call for a petition of concern, it means that the legislation is stopped. So what has happened, and therefore, is that much legislation, what will be described as progressive legislation, can be, and any progressive legislation can be stalled by a petition of concern, and it has meant that there has been a lot of, if you like, progressive legislation has been stalled. There's, in terms of social issues such as abortion, women's rights, gay and lesbian rights, are all on the back burner in Northern Ireland because of ultra-conservative religious positions in some quarters. So at the moment, the assembly is up and running, but its survival effectively by doing nothing. It took them 7 months to issue a program of what they call a program of government, but it has no timelines, no definitive time frames at all. A lot of aspirations, which means that it's effectively aspirational rather than anything else. Now, several factors about Northern Ireland. The fact is that Northern Ireland is now no longer a vital strategic link or a bastion of empire. So therefore, the reaction from London is quite different to what it would have been in the past. For strategic reasons, the British, while still significant influence in the globe, is no longer the global superpower that it was even 50, 60 years ago, certainly not at the turn of the century when Northern Ireland was formed. Britain no longer depends on Northern Ireland for its own strategic defence. Where we used to have important deep sea water ports to protect the North Atlantic, for example, during the Second World War, that's not as vital any longer with the arrival of deep water submarines that can stay underwater for months to protect the coast, protect the shipping lanes. In terms of aircraft, satellites are now providing the intelligence that in the past would have come from aircraft flying out from Northern Ireland. And ultimately, although possibly not really something that would appeal to the British public in general, but Britain is no longer really depending for its defence on the Royal Navy or the Royal Air Force, although they're still there and still a power. But really, the United Kingdom depends on the United States of America for its defence. Therefore, Northern Ireland has been reduced in terms of its military essential nature for the British Empire. Now, that doesn't mean to say that Britain is not interested in what happens in Northern Ireland or Ireland, but effectively Britain is more concerned and more determined to have a relationship with a compliant Dublin than it is with Northern Ireland. So, in many ways, Britain is content now to allow Northern Ireland to drift. It's the British deep state, whatever it has said in Parliament, certainly the deep state in Britain recognises the reality of the situation. And because the demographics are changing as a result of 50 years of emphasis on, partly because of the trouble, of the violence, partly because of demands for civil rights, it's no longer possible for a Northern Ireland-based Parliament to exercise the type of discrimination that worked in the past to contain the population headcount, forcing effectively the nationalist population in many cases, into immigration through lack of housing and employment. Since that has now been no longer quite possible to the same extent, the population demographics are changing in favour of a nationalist population. Now, the last census taken in 2021 indicated that there were a greater number of people claiming to come from a Catholic background than from a Protestant background. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean to say that every Catholic would vote for United Ireland or that every Protestant would vote for a United Kingdom, but what was once described as a Protestant Parliament for a Protestant people is no longer quite possible to emphasise or operate as such. However, in the past, there might have been a conspiracy from the British deep state to maintain the regime in Northern Ireland, it's no longer quite as important to them. So what's happening now actually is that London is working more with Dublin than it would be with Belfast, although possibly it mightn't look like that. But take, for example, the time of Brexit. Dublin, as the Republic of Ireland, was concerned that if what you call a hard border, a physical border was created, again, there remains the frontier between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But if it was to be highlighted with customs posts, military outposts, that it could cause resumption of hostilities. So in order to stop or to prevent that happening, London agreed that Northern Ireland would remain within the European Union's common market area. And that has caused some distress for unionists because they see this as a concession to Dublin. But having said that, it emphasised the fact that Dublin is seen in London as a more useful ally than Belfast. And Britain was willing to introduce what they call the protocol to keep Northern Ireland economically within the European Union, while the rest of Britain had withdrawn. In fact, indicating that Britain saw the Southern Irish as more useful allies on the island and more open to influence. I think, again, within the last couple of days, there has been an incident or an event here in Ireland. What has happened for a period of time, for those of you that are unaware, that there's a huge organisation in Ireland called the Gaelic Athletic Association, which is effectively an All-Ireland athletic association, which has been in the past very much pro-nationalist. It has effectively, maybe we could describe it as a pan-nationalist front, if you like. And it was told that it could build, the British government help fund a new football stadium in Belfast called Casement Park, which would host soccer matches in 2008 in the European Nations Cup. Now, within the last couple of days, the British government has withdrawn the offer to fund the stadium in Belfast, saying it was too expensive. Now, in reality, at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, the fact that the GAA, which is seen as a very pro-nationalist organisation, at the time of 20 years ago, Britain would have certainly been willing to pay the less than 300 million, about approximately 300 million pound, to bring the GAA and all its space into its orbit. But now that it's willing to drop it, to annoy the GAA, if you like, or to disadvantage the GAA, is indicative, I would argue, of Britain's lack of concern with what's happening in the north of Ireland. The fact is that, and I think maybe I'll start to wind down at this here and ask Jimmy to take the chairperson to take us into discussion, if you like, but that I think we've got to be careful about what's happening in Northern Ireland at the moment because of the old colonial mentality and playing of what we know as the orange card, that to hope for workers' unity is asking possibly too much while we still have partition, while we still have the union with Britain. I still subscribe to the James Connolly view that only an All-Ireland Workers' Republic will answer that. Now, the direction of travel at the moment is towards probably what they call a referendum on the border, on the existence of partition. Eventually, within the next number of decades, maybe not within the next few years, but certainly within the next 2 to 3 decades, there will be a referendum on the connection with Britain. It probably will result in an end to partition. The fact is, however, that it will not necessarily lead to a socialist state or a republic, because British deep state has worked to influence the Southern Irish government, which has been open to influence for the past century or so, since its foundation. The Southern Irish bourgeoisie, who are effectively in control of the Southern state, are determined not to allow a radical departure if they can. So there's a task that unity does not necessarily mean there will be, it does not mean at all an end to partition, an end to the British connection will not necessarily lead to socialism, but we've got to work on that now. The fact is that one of the best ways to work on it is work on it south of the border as well, where in the Republic of Ireland, the National Health Service in the Republic of Ireland is two-tier. It's both private and public. Public is underfunded. Private is the option for so many people because of the need to access care. There's a housing crisis in the Republic of Ireland, and there's a great discrepancy in terms of equality. What I'm saying is that there is nothing of it. South of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, offers little attractions to the Protestant working class. Significantly, though, is unionism now that those in favour of the union with the United Kingdom, because of differences of interpretation and realisation. There's now possibly 4 strands, at least, within unionism. There's one of what's known as the traditional unionist voice, which is ultra right wing, no compromise whatsoever. Then there's the largest unionist party, the Democratic Unionist Party, which is a party created by the Reverend Ian Paisley in the past. Right wing, very much in favour of holding on to the union. Slightly apart from that, then it's the Ulster Unionist Party, which is smaller but slightly more progressive, not as aggressively hostile to nationalism. And then there's another strand, which is called the Alliance Party, which is technically agnostic on the question of the union with Britain, but its elected representatives come largely from areas in which there was in the past a unionist majority. Now, to put those in class terms, usually the Alliance Party voters are more middle class bourgeoisie, petty bourgeois, also unionists, petty bourgeois, DUP and TUV, largely working class. The fact is that since the Republic now has changed in terms of its social policies, if not its economic policies, it's no longer quite a Catholic state as it used to be in the past. It has introduced some progressive legislation in terms of women's rights, LGBT rights. The Catholic Church has taken a serious setback in terms of its influence. Middle-class unionists in the north of Ireland are now relatively comfortable with the concept of Ireland. The fact is that while if asked for a choice, they would opt to remain within the union, but because of their class position, they find it quite comfortable. They go south, they visit the Republic of Ireland quite often. They're familiar with it. And if a border poll was to result in a vote against the union, they would be quite content to stay within the new departure. But that's because they have of their privileged position. The fact is, the Protestant or unionist working class are concerned that their conditions would not improve at all within a new Ireland. So, to make things different, I think we've got to promote socialism in the south of Ireland as strongly as we would ever in the north. So socialism that would guarantee the basics of life, national health service, public housing, workers' rights, an end to the imperial influence in the Republic of Ireland, where Shannon Airport is open to the US military coming and going on its way to arm and equip the various outposts of the US Empire, so that if those places, if that was closed off, that would certainly offer a better way. And just one thing that I can say is this, that within the last few months, I had a delegation from visitors, tourists from Germany, from Switzerland, German-speaking Swiss came to Belfast. I showed them around, and we visited a UDA stronghold in South Belfast, where we met with certain members of the Loyalist community, and several leading members of that community assured us that while they did not want to see a united Ireland or a different Ireland, that they would be quite happy to abide by the democratic outcome of a referendum. So I think we can't surrender to despair, that given the option and given the proper promotion of a socialist agenda south of the border as well as north of the border, with the implementation, more the implementation. There's no point talking just about promoting an agenda. We've got to see it implemented, that we have a comprehensive national health service in the Republic, public housing in the Republic, workers' rights in the Republic, an end to imperialism in terms of its facilitating US military, and promotion of equality. Just for a start, would leave us that we could sell this case to a wider population in the Northern Ireland of a better future. So maybe we'll leave it at that.
Tommy, I don't know how you had the stamina to keep going. I salute you. There's one thing I just want to bring a personal observation into what Tommy said. Some of the comrades will know I'm having difficulty with my mobility, and I'm finding it very, very difficult to get through the medical service in the Republic. I've spent years waiting. Now I'm finally onto a consultant list to be told I'm going to spend years waiting yet again. The lists I'm looking at are public lists, lists that the state bears the responsibility for. Yet the same state that won't put enough money into the Republic Medical Service will offer me tomorrow morning an option of going to Northern Ireland, getting the surgery that I need, provided I pay the surgeons, the private surgeons in the north, and they will then reimburse me every penny that I spend to the private sector. And that's a crazy, crazy hypocrisy, but that's the reality of life in Ireland, north and south. I would like to offer the meeting open to the floor. So if any comrades wish to speak, can you put up your flags or put up your hands, because I can see everybody on the same screen. Very shy. Niall, are you coming in there, or Kieran rather?
Yeah, well, I am planning to speak, Jimmy, but I do think I would wait a little bit, given that I'm also from the north, and maybe if others come in first, it'll be a better discussion. But rather than me just coming straight after Tommy, but I can.
Yeah, fire away, Kieran. You're sounding.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, Tommy, so thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tommy, for a very interesting introduction. I don't know whether you remember me, Tommy, or not, but we've debated before. We debated at the Socialist Party 2012 conference. on can we bring down the peace lines, bring down the peace lines in Belfast, the peace walls, 2012, and we've met since then to discuss trade union work. I don't know whether you
Yes,
recall
yes.
that or not. Yes, but it's been some time. It's been a few years. So thank you very much. It's discussing the North or Northern Ireland to people outside the North. I think it is difficult because it's a hard place to fully understand and fully comprehend unless you live here. Tommy's right that the origins of the problems lie hundreds of years ago, 800 years ago, when Britain, England, formed its first colony. Ireland was Britain's first colony, the beginning of the British Empire. And then 400 to 450 years ago, the conscious process of what was called plantation, so settling English and Scottish settlers in mostly in Northern Ireland, in the north of Ireland, in order to provide a bastion of support. That's where the problems lie in the historic sense. But today, where I live and work and where Tommy lives and work, when I go to work tomorrow, the people around me are approximately 50% from a Catholic background and 50% from a Protestant background. And the trade unions in the main are mixed. The workplaces are mixed. The living areas, the geographical areas are not mixed. People tend to live either in Catholic areas or Protestant areas. But we have a situation today in 2024 where working class people mix in the workplace, belong to the same trade unions, have the same problems, but have different identities. But as we understand as Marxists, it's more complicated than that because they have a shared working class identity. They belong to the same trade union, but they go back to a different area when the workplace locks up for the night, and they have a different identity in the sense some identify as British, people from Protestant background, and some identify as Irish, people from a Catholic background. Some identify as Northern Irish, take an equidistant position, if you like. But the evidence is that at times of increased tension and conflict around any particular issue, and in Northern Ireland, we have multiple issues that can cause increases in tension and conflict. For example, over contentious parades going through areas where they're not wanted, or over the flying of flags. At times such as that, everyone or almost everyone tends to take a side. So even people who say, well, I'm neutral on some of these issues, they tend not to be neutral at those times. So the question is, what's it about? What's the conflict about? What has the last 50 years of conflict been about? And what's the way forward? And what's the role of socialists in all of this? I mean, that's the question, I think, for everyone looking in from the outside. So it is about identity. I think it's the best way to describe it. But though it is more complex, as Tommy will agree. So people's different aspirations, national aspirations, which is not the same as saying there are two nations in Ireland. I think most Marxists would not hold that there are two nations, but there is a distinct Protestant community with different national aspirations, which is getting smaller whilst the Catholic community is growing, which does mean that we are moving to a point at some stage, could be within 10 years, but I think Tommy's right, more likely to 20, 30 years, there will be a referendum on the future of the North. And at that time, it is likely there will be a vote for the ending of partition, a united Ireland. But I think the long run up to that point, and especially the months running up to that referendum and the period afterwards, I think are fraught with danger. And I know what Tommy's saying, and I've heard it too, various loyalist leaders. And by loyalist, that's a term by which we usually mean the more extreme end of unionism, and often historically that has meant the extreme end of unionism, who are prepared to fight, who are prepared to pick up a gun. Some loyalist leaders have said they're prepared to accept the democratic outcome of a referendum. And I think, Tommy, you said we have to be optimistic, but I think there are reasons to be pessimistic, that it is easy to say we will accept the outcome, we will not fight, when it seems to be a dim and distant prospect. But when a referendum gets closer and closer, then there will be sections of the Protestant community who I believe will begin to consider the possibility of refusing to accept the outcome and the fighting, of resisting by force, in arms. I think that is more likely than not, especially because, and precisely because of the problems caused by capitalism. So if you don't have enough good jobs, if you don't have a good health service, if you don't have good access to education, conditions of scarcity, we know that conditions of scarcity anywhere on the globe causes conflict, and capitalism deliberately stokes that conflict. So in conditions of scarcity, Protestant and Catholic tend to oppose each other unless people like us counter that. In that context, the move towards United Ireland will not be smooth. It'll be a movement which will intend to increase tension and increase the danger of further conflict. So the role of socialists in that, as Tommy said, is to fight for socialism today and every day, to fight for trade union rights, to fight for better working conditions, north and south, so that north and south we're fighting on either side of the border for the same outcome, but also linking up, of course, with our brothers and sisters in England, Scotland, and Wales, because we have much in common. Northern Ireland, south of Ireland, Ireland as a whole, England, Scotland, and Wales, there's free movement of people. There has been since the 1920s, predates the European Union, and historically, Irish people have gone to Britain for work, and they're very intermingled communities in many ways. The trade union movement is intermingled in various ways. So we have to think about building unity in the north on a day-to-day basis, building unity across the border in shared struggle, building unity on the islands, Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, in shared struggle, as we move towards what will be a very difficult denouement for the state of Northern Ireland, which has now existed for 100 years, but there's much to say that its end is in sight. But the danger for us is that the end will not be simple doing away a partition and a new peaceful future, but the end will be repartition, further conflict and repartition. That's the danger, which may not be in our lifetimes, but it could be. It could be sooner than we think. So we just need to be careful about that. I mean, I could say more, but I'm sort of minded to stop at this point, because I'd imagine there'll be more discussion and more questions coming up, and I might want to speak more than once. I'm sure I know Tommy will sum up, but I might want to come back on some of these points.
Thanks, Kieran. Any other comrade wish to come in with any points, questions? The other thing is that Kieran referred to later on. Tommy will have a chance to come in. He will obviously be concluding the meeting, but during the meeting itself, should any comrades wish to ask specific questions of Tommy, or indeed of any other comrades, they would have the right. Tommy will have the right to intervene and give his position, and rather than waiting for the summing up, particularly if it's an issue that's part of a discussion. Ben.
Comrades, I want to thank Tommy for a very comprehensive and wide-ranging introduction to the topic. And you cover a lot of the historical aspects that explain the current divisions in society. But the most important thing that you said that we need to focus on is that the solution to all of these problems rests with the working class, the organised labour movement, and in line with the policies promulgated by Connolly, a workers' republic, and we must keep our focus all the time around that. But we need to just mention in the discussion that Ireland is a modern industrial economy, a modern industrial country, with urbanisation and the majority of workers living in cities, whether it be Belfast, Cork, Dublin, Limerick, or whatever. We need to bear that in mind, because the trade union movement in Ireland, north and south, is united. There's a single trade union structure, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, which incorporates workers in the north, workers in the south, public service workers, industrial workers. Some unions span the border, like Unite, for example, has members north and south. The INTO, the teachers' unions, has members north and south. So through all the worst aspects of the conflict, the working class organisationally and structurally has remained united. And some of the more active trades councils are in the north, such as the Derry Trades Council, the Belfast Trades Council. In the south, there's similarly a number of trades councils. So the working class activity has continued, irrespective of the difficulties that are placed in their way. But something which is very glaring is that there is no organisation, no united or even north or south, big representation of the labour movement by a political party. There is no party such as the Labour Party, Social Democratic Party, or a party based on the trade unions, either north or south. And that wasn't always the case. There have been opportunities in the past to create a working class organisation with socialist policies at various times through our history. I mean, we don't need to go into them now, but even in recent times, I mean, the NILP, even though in the end it became just part of the unionist structure, was in a significant place in terms of the unions. The Southern Labour Party in the South was at one point the largest of the political parties in terms of the opinion polls. Now it's a very, very small organisation, something in the region of 4%. The Southern Labour Party was based on the trade union movement, where you had massive affiliation of the big parties such as the Transport Union. That's now ceased. There's no union affiliation has been stopped. There were big opportunities in the 69 struggles, as Tommy will know, to bring the working class together, as they were together at various times. And all the opportunities have been spurned. The question now is, where do we go? The danger is that we get swept along into a yes-no position with regard to referenda, unity in general, and all this kind of stuff. But that's not the way in which the problems will be resolved. There has to be working class unity, and there has to be a program, a socialist program, for example, on the area of public services, an expanded public service provision in the areas of education, of health, of welfare, of housing. So that program needs to be advanced in a united way. Now, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions leadership speaks of such a program, but they never campaign on it. They never try to intervene politically. So the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, which unites workers north and south, is in a position, if they choose to do so, to advance a common program with regard to housing. The policy stands for public housing, a public house building company under the aegis of the state, public land being used for housing, to end the reliance on the private sector and on private landowners. And that's the policy, but it's never been pursued. There needs to be a health service that expands to cover the needs of people, where provision is free at the point of delivery, such as was the case with the NHS when it was first formed. We need to get back to that thinking. In the South, there are two health services, one which is private, one which is public, and the public is absolutely in a terrible state. You have to wait a year for an appointment or longer. If you want to talk to a doctor, you'll be lucky to get a phone call after 2 days. Children are disadvantaged in the various areas of health provision. Then in welfare, there's cuts in provision. So all across the public service, there needs to be unity, north and south, around a common program. Now, there has been a discussion, Tom will be aware of this, about in the discussion about United Ireland, which does form a certain, it has a certain public presence. What has to be the attitude of the trade union movement and of the left in that discussion? And that hasn't come to the fore at all. So when we're talking about unity, we're not talking about a show of hands as to who's for unity and who's against, because that won't resolve anything. It won't happen anyway on that basis. The issue to be discussed is what program do we advance towards working class unity. So when we talk about a workers' republic, as Tommy has alluded to, we need to spell out in a bit more detail what exactly will that workers' republic, what kind of issues will they resolve. So I think we need to focus a lot on that. Tommy has mentioned it himself, and we need to focus a lot on the program for Irish unity, and maybe in public discussion, the labour movement needs to make a bigger intervention in these discussions and not be swept along on this thing about the border poll and the rest of it. That won't resolve it. And it may well actually deepen sectarian division in the run-up to it, which is the last thing we want. So the way to avoid that is to advance a common program, not just in terms of public services, but also in terms of public ownership, and to focus the discussion around issues of that nature. And then we will get back with a genuinely immediate perspective of building a movement for a workers' republic, north and south, such as Tommy alluded to in his opening contribution.
Thanks, Finn. Dominic or John?
Right. John speaking. I think myself, I'm following up on what Finn has just said. If one goes back to 68, 69, there was optimism about building, if you like, working class unity. The position was one where you had in the north the People's Democracy, which was a student-based organisation, but that was calling for, if you like, working class unity. You had Bernadette Devlin, who was very much the public figure of that. She stood in an election in Mid-Ulster and was elected MP for that constituency. And at the time, it was reckoned that she had somewhere in the region of 6,000 or 7,000 Protestant votes. So there was an echo within, if you like, the unionist community for the position she spelt out, which was basically a socialist position of wanting better housing, better jobs, and end to discrimination, etc. But what intervened was two things. One, the unionists mobilised the Orange Order, they mobilised the RUC, and they, if you like, battered the Catholics wherever they could into submission or into revolt. They brought in, if you like, what do you call it, internment without trial. You had the Ballymurphy massacre, you had the Bloody Sunday massacre in Derry. And on the other side, you had the active involvement of elements of the Southern Irish government, Blaney, Haughey and Boland, if you like, involved in gun running to the nationalist elements within the Republican movement that wanted socialism swept off the agenda. You also had, I think there was a Captain Kelly who was actively involved. He was an agent of the Southern government. So what you had were people hell-bent on wrecking any unity within the working class. And I think, as Finn has said, it's no good just saying we want a united Ireland, those in favour, those against. It's a matter of campaigning for the sort of Ireland we want to see north and south of the border. The irony is that in Britain, something like 9% of the gross domestic product is used in health. In Southern Ireland, I think the figure is something like 14%. But if you were to ask which was the better health service, north or south, people by and large would say north. The NHS is far better than the Southern Irish health service, because the Southern Irish health service, that 14%, is largely taken up with private practice. On Radio Aaron, I think it was a couple of years ago, one surgeon said before he can do anything, he has to take out insurance costing him £100,000 against public liability. So if you like, there is money there in the south for health service. Forgive me. But it's largely based on private practice. A small percent of the population do very well, and the vast majority don't do well at all. So I think, as Finn has said, it is a matter of seriously campaigning for better conditions both north and south of the border, and not just having it linked to do we want a united Ireland or not a united Ireland, but a better condition for the working class. And in that sense, if the issue comes of a united Ireland, I think that would be one where there would be a positive response to that question, but only on the basis that it'd be better than what we've got at the present time. You know, that we want to see serious money spent on housing, education, and the health service. So I'll leave it at that, comrades.
Thanks, John. Finn, your hand is up. Is that a fresh?
It's just a brief point that I forgot.
Yeah, go ahead.
I forgot to mention. Comrades probably don't know this, but the European Commission and the European Court of Justice have ruled that the Irish government would receive 14 billion in taxes from Apple, a major multinational operating in Ireland. The Irish government went to court. This happened in 2016, 2018, 2006, 2008, around that period. The Irish government went to court with Apple, supporting Apple's case that the tax was unjustified. So they were being presented with 14 billion. They went to court and spent 10 million in legal fees to stop the government receiving 14 billion. Now, comrades may not know that. That's the current situation. And now that point is seen as controversial. So there's 14 million in the bank, 14 billion, I'm sorry. There's 14 billion in the bank of taxes due from Apple, and the government sees that as a crisis. They see it as some kind of a slight. It's absolutely ridiculous. And as I say, there's a 10 million bill that the government spent on defending Apple and supporting Apple's case that the tax should not be paid. Now, all this arose from the link between capitalism and the Irish government. The Irish government did special deals with big companies like Apple, ensuring that they didn't have to pay tax, and they worked to fiddle money that was earned abroad from the working class activities abroad was channeled through Ireland, where the taxes were lower. And it's as a result of these measures that the European Court of Justice ruled that Apple now owes 14 billion to the Irish government. And as I say, this doesn't get the attention it deserves because it's not just the money, it's an illustration of the cap-in-hand attitude of the Irish government to international capitalist companies, particularly the major big multinationals in America. I intended saying out my open contribution, I just overlooked this, so I'm sorry for coming back.
Every time I hear about that 14 billion, then think of me left leg. Say a whole medical service for the whole island for that sort of money. But it's interesting that the government said they have no plans to spend it as yet. So even if they do get the money, it's going to go somewhere to make interest and do nothing with it. Any other comrade wish to comment? See Roger looking deeply. No. Tommy, did you want to come in yourself to make any comment on anything that has been put to the meeting?
I suppose I could make a couple of points. Certainly, Finn's point about the programme from organised labour, I think, is very valid. It's just a pity that the ICTU, while passing motions, don't actually actively pursue the motion. For example, public housing is just one that would be crying out for implementation. We need public housing desperately. Same with health service, National Health Service, free at the point of entry. And our comrade there in England who spoke about the 14% of GDP of Southern Irish GNI spent on health services, something similar to what's happening in the United States of America. And the health service in the Republic of Ireland is very similar to that in the United States of America, where you get treatment if you can afford to pay for it. Now, there's no reason why that money couldn't be allocated into a public health service and to the benefit of all. So I think it's important that we start to use whatever influence we can through the trade union movement to ask or demand of the organisation that it starts to actively pursue and implement implementation of the policy. We can advocate policies all we like, but we've got to see them implemented as well. I think that's very important to do that. And I agree with Finn, that's a programme that Labour has been left waiting, as De Valera said. De Valera used to say about Labour must wait, and Labour has waited far too bloody long. As the point Kieran made about the threat of a emerging threat from border poll, I think that's correct. I think what has to be done, instead of ignoring the fact that there's liable to be border poll, I think it has to be explained and talked about rather than ignored until it emerges, because it's really inviting violence. Not to say that there won't be certain irreconcilables, but I think that if it's explained, particularly if we have the conditions created in the Republic of Ireland where economic conditions are so much better, and that's why I emphasise the need to approach the programme in the Republic of Ireland as well as the North, that it has to have be an attractive proposition. Put it this way, the unionist middle class has reconciled itself to a considerable extent to what make the outcome of border poll, because they're content, they have the contentment with the Republic of Ireland, and they see themselves as fitting in nicely with the Southern Irish bourgeoisie. I think if the Northern working class unionist working class were to see an attractive proposition south of the border, it would be a lot easier to talk them down from a position of violence, to minimise the risk as best we can. And I think it can be done, but it has to have to talk about it, have to plan for it, have to work for it. And to go back to the point that Finn made, we've got to see that programme implemented of housing, education, health service, equality, workers' rights has to be implemented. There's no point just talking, allowing the ICTU to pass worthy motions. We've got to see them enacted.
So, tell me, you reminded me there of an employer I had about 20 years ago. I worked for a company in Newton Ards, and they were tell me since they're frozen. I was saying there, Tom, I worked for a company in Newton Ards, and they were a bunch of a family business, and they were loyal members of the lodge, and every occasion that was required, they had their little bowlers and they had their little sashes, and they were out marching, celebrating. Yet that family were quite adamant that they would have preferred to have, say, in a united Ireland. But the motivation that they had was it would mean one simple taxation on the island, one set of wages to be negotiated, one set of rules for business, and for all the commercial reasons, kept them in the security and privilege that they had. And it kind of surprised me that people who had the apparent trappings of sectarianism and based on an apparent political security, the reality of their profiteering meant they had a totally different understanding of the benefits of uniting the workers in their interest. The big problem we have is trying to unite them in our interest. Any other comrades yet again? Kieran, do you want to come back in and elaborate from where you left off?
Well, yes, just briefly. Jimmy, thanks. And obviously there are comrades here from all over the world, and it's difficult to look from other parts of the world and think yourself into the situation in Ireland, in the north of Ireland, because of our own peculiarities. But I think it's possible to do it, and it is possible to draw comparisons with other parts of the world where, as Marxists, we would talk about the unresolved national question. So the national question was posed everywhere in the 19th century. New nation states were formed, but some nation states were still born, or were partitioned, or national questions remain unresolved. So one example is Ireland, another is Cyprus. There's one comment here from Cyprus where you have a divided island, but it's a complex situation. You know, the Turkish North, the majority don't wish for unity at this time, for example. The ex-Yugoslavia, all the countries had made up Yugoslavia, and the series of civil wars there in the 1990s. Unresolved national questions remain to today, for example, in Bosnia and Serbia and Kosovo. And of course, you have the situation in Gaza, in Israel, which is a very complex situation. But what all those situations have in common, all of those parts of the globe, all the geographical areas, it is peoples living side by side or interwoven, intermingled, who have different national identities. And how do we solve this? How do we solve this in the 21st century? What's the role of socialists? It's the same point I made earlier. So, for example, in Ireland, in the north of Ireland, Catholics were coerced into Northern Ireland. You know, they were through violence. It was a very intense period of violence in 1920, 1921, 23, in Belfast in particular, where hundreds died. So Catholics didn't acquiesce or didn't agree to the establishment of the Northern Ireland state. They had no choice. And so, in essence, it's been 100 years of coercion. The Catholics are forced to stay within the borders of a state that they never agreed to in the first place. But are we to replace that with the coercion of Protestants? So Protestants don't agree that there should be United Ireland, what do we do at that point? What would socialists argue should be done at that point? So let's say there is a border poll, and let's say 80% of the people in Northern Ireland agree to United Ireland, 20% vote against, or 30%. And the 20 or 30% say, well, we still don't agree. We don't accept the outcome of the poll. What happens at that point? Well, what would socialists say at that point? What would our argument be? And obviously, what we'd like to achieve, all of us, and Tommy would agree, is we never want to be at that point. We never want to get to that position. We want to be in a position where there's greater unity between Catholic and Protestant within Northern Ireland, across the border, and across these islands, so that we can have a united Ireland with maximum autonomy for those who want it, and with maximum links with the working class of the other island, the working class of the other countries, nations on these islands, in order to avoid that situation. But otherwise, it's a very difficult situation that socialists can't avoid, because there are some socialist groups who simply say there should be a border poll now. In effect, some groups do campaign for that. People for profit, for example, that's their position: a border poll now. So the question has to be then, if there's a border poll now and there's a very, very narrow majority for United Ireland, 50% plus one, what would your position be then? What happens next? And in the absence of socialism, so a border poll, 50% plus one under capitalism, are we in favour then of the state then taking action to enforce the outcome? So that would be in favour of. So those are the sort of discussions I think we need to have. Can't have them all here, but sort of things we need to have over the coming weeks, months, years as we prepare for that future scenario. We need to think it through. We need to think it through concretely, and not just put forward abstract positions which aren't actually dealing with the reality of this place.
Thanks, Kieran. I wanted to ask a question myself, and either Tommy or Kieran may be closer to the understanding of it. It's in relation to Sinn Féin. Recently, we saw the fragmentation of a section of the Progressive Unionist Party, the old Paisley Party, and a little bit of chaos in their leadership and setbacks in electoral terms. At the same time, we saw what appeared to be a stabilisation and an ambition of Sinn Féin to become the government in the north and in the south. Then, in opinion polls recently, Sinn Féin in the south started to go backwards. Now, I know Sinn Féin is carrying the crisis of their leader has particular health problems and very serious family problems, which has sort of muted activity there. And it seems that the party, which traditionally made their speeches through their leadership. The question I would ask is there a possibility or any indications of possibilities that Sinn Féin will not become the government of all sections of the island and could in fact go backwards in the same way that the Progressive Unionists and previously the official Unionists and the SDLP went? Would the comrades have any views on that?
Do you want me to mention an opinion?
I've unmuted. Got my hand up.
I think, Jimmy, that with two different, to an extent, there's two different electorates on the island. Sinn Féin has two different electorates on the island. In the north, there is the tendency, because of history and events more recent, to vote sometimes against rather than for. So Sinn Féin wins in a lot of cases in the 6 counties around Northern Ireland on the basis that there are people who are voting against Unionists rather than for Sinn Féin. And that doesn't happen south of the border in the Republic of Ireland. Sinn Féin has fallen back dramatically over the last 12 months. And in a lot of cases because it has followed, if you like, a populist agenda. It hasn't, it has flip-flopped and has been seen to flip-flop on so many issues. And I think it should have to become a populist party rather than anything else. Maybe difficulties with leadership, the health issues, but I mean, I think it's a question of its refusal to adhere to a program and saying to be following a populist program, it has been exposed for lack of sincerity, lack of direction.
Okay, Tom. Karen, you any comments like that? But
Well, just on that issue, Jimmy, just quickly, in my view, the idea that Sinn Féin would be part of the next government was never that strong a possibility. It was talked about as if it was an established fact, but to me, it never seemed that likely. Even if they hit the very high point of the, that they scored in the percentages in the opinion polls, their low 30s, they would still be outvoted, and they would still be outvoted in the terms of government formation by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And all of the parties would line up to exclude them from government. To me, that always seemed the most likely outcome. Now, the idea that Sinn Féin will form part of the next government is, I think, more or less excluded. But what will happen in time is an open question. We don't know. As Tommy says, it's a very different electorate in the south, voting for different reasons, and we don't know. It's an open question. In the north, we have to be careful, not to think of northern politics like politics in other places where parties go up and down and compete for votes. So I know everybody knows this, but just to restate it, that the large Unionist Party, the Democratic Unionist Party, and Sinn Féin, the largest nationalist or Catholic party, they don't compete for votes. There's no crossover vote. There's nobody who changes their mind at the ballot box and thinks, oh, we'll vote for Sinn Féin, not the DUP today. But sometimes commentators in Britain talk as if that is the case, so it's not like that. So instead you have voting blocks. You have a nationalist voting block and a unionist voting block. The dominant party can change, as Tommy says, as Jimmy says, it's changed in the north. The official unionists and for decades, and now the Democratic Unionists. It could change again. And within nationalism, you had the SDLP and then Sinn Féin. It could change again. Nothing lasts forever. We understand politics is in a constant state of flux. It is possible a new force could emerge. It is possible that the SDLP will continue to decline, and in the fallout, a new nationalist party could be formed. That's possible. That would subsume both Sinn Féin and the SDLP. But I don't think it's likely in the next period, the next number of years. It would probably take big events, major developments for that to happen. So, I mean, if I had to look into the future, Sinn Féin will remain the largest nationalist party and the largest party overall in the north for the next 5 to 10 years. I don't think Sinn Féin will be in power in the south of the border in the next 5 to 10 years. To me, that seems less likely. So in a way, you have a continuation of where we are now, which is like an interregnum. It is an intermediate period where the north is seen as being unviable, and it's widely accepted to be unviable by many commentators, by people who live in the north, especially Catholics. But the future is not yet in sight. The border poll isn't about to happen. It's some way off. I think that's more likely. Now, of course, that could be good for the workers' movement, because if sites are, if people don't have their sights on a border poll, if it seems less likely, the idea of Sinn Féin and government north and south seems less likely, that can be of assistance to the movement in terms of developing a real class-based alternative. So I don't see it as a negative development that Sinn Féin have gone back in the south. I think in effect it's a positive development from our perspective. And it is very much tied in with Sinn Féin moving to the right. They were never a socialist party, even in any real sense, but of course they had left policies. But the left policies have been weakened for years now, for decades. But in the recent period, some of their flip-flopping, some of the issues like immigration, so some of the policies they've adopted are dangerously close to right populism. Close, I wouldn't say they are there yet, but close to it. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, Jimmy. I think I jumped in front of Dominic. He'd put his hand up first. Sorry about that.
With that, we'll give it to Dominic.
Yeah, I just think that we've got to view this in the way I see it, and that is that world capitalism is lining up to really take on the working class and really crush it. And I think the trade union movement will say anything, but won't do anything. The leadership is not prepared to do anything to fight for the workers' rights. I'm not talking about national unions where occasional leaders do stand up. I'm talking about the overall thing as far as your TUCs and that sort of organisation. And with regard to
Sinn Féin as an aside. I mean, my view of Sinn Féin is it was born in the same stable as Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the two other capitalist parties in the south, and it'll finish up going to bed with them. I don't think it's got any option. If you look at its history, the Provos were deliberately created to fight against any form of socialism developing in the north. That was the whole issue of their formation. So that the way they're going to go in the future and the way they flip-flopped on, or not flip-flopped, the way they thought there was a few votes in being anti-immigrant just shows you the sort of undercurrent of what their policies are. Now, I think as far as we're concerned and as far as socialists are concerned, the real question is, how do you take up the challenge that's coming ahead? And unless the working class unite and prove, particularly in Northern Ireland, that fighting for socialist ideas is fighting for all workers and people of all workers' rights and conditions, and proving that to the Protestant workers, that if the question of a referendum on the border comes up, you're going to get the likes of Paisley's. Obviously, he's dead, but you're going to get demagogues stepping up in the Protestant community and saying this is a popish plot, or whatever phrases they want to use these days, but basically saying, trying to split the workers against each other. And unless it's proved beforehand that there is an actual fight for socialist ideas and a fight for socialist policies, and it's not something that arises when a referendum comes up, but it starts now. And that's the thing that we've got to take up, is that the trade unions and the labour movement has got to really look at what fights are coming up and saying that the working class now needs to be ready, now needs to be united to defend its interests and protect it against the onslaught that the capitalists are preparing against us. And I think that's the way it's got to be looked at, not events happening and what do we do then. The agenda should be there now, quite clearly, that we need action and we need that sort of campaign. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Dominic. Still not know that comrade want to take advantage of it. Just one comment, and it was touched on by some of the comrades, is that in the recent disturbances in both North and the South of Ireland on racist issues that I've seen, protests against migrants, I've seen burning of buildings, public buildings, and so that. I've seen street battles and seen counter demonstrations. It's sad. Well, it's sad for Sinn Féin themselves, but they made the tragic mistake that all opportunists make of trying to read the signs of which way the communities are going. And they totally misread it, and they just started to raise demands and raise sympathy for the demands of the racists. And now they're beginning to feel the cold chill that they're out of tune with the working class in the South on this particular attitude. While there are some numbers, and in terms of the electoral test, there were thousands who voted for the racists, the general view of the community is that Sinn Féin got it wrong and it's going to work. Finn, you're back up again.
Just want to make a small contribution to this discussion about the split in the Sinn Féin movement that gave rise to the Pros. I was at the conference of Sinn Féin in 1970 when the split happened. The IRA, which at that time met separately, they decided in August, the split emerged the previous August, and the discussion in January 1970 led to the split and the creation of provision of Sinn Féin. However, the point I want to make is the argument at the time was about recognising the Southern Parliament, and that's what the vote was about. But in reality, that was just a cover. The real thing was, as one of the comrades mentioned, I think it was John, that Fianna Fáil, Blaney in particular, Haughey probably less so, and Boland and some Fianna Fáil ministers intervened in the Sinn Féin movement, which was then moving to the left in the 60s, the late 60s. It was a left-wing organisation with mass campaigns. They wanted to steer the Sinn Féin and the IRA towards a nationalist struggle and confine it to the north, and not to have class issues being raised in the south. So that's the way in which the Provos emerged. But the issue at the convention wasn't about whether we should form a separate command in the north. It was about whether we should recognise the Southern Parliament. I remember some of the discussions. There were very well-known left-wing people at the time, Maureen de Burke, Cathal Gooley and others in Sinn Féin. And then there was a right-wing group whom I wasn't familiar with, which would have included Joe Cahill and people like that, probably Adams, who would have been young, Sean McStephen and others, but I wasn't familiar with these names. But their contributions at the time were very sentimental. They were saying, if Cathal Brewer, that's an Irish revolutionary leader, was here today, what would he think? And all this kind of stuff. They weren't dealing with the issues at all. So when the Provos emerged, on the basis of a split, then the situation developed because Britain, or the British Army, as Tommy will know only too well, was conducting attacks in the Catholic areas and were taking the offensive against the Catholic areas. And then the Provost picked up a lot of momentum and a lot of support, particularly following Bloody Sunday, where there was a slaughter of innocent people during a civil rights march. So the movement took off, and the Provosts were there at the time and could capitalise on it. But that doesn't make them a permanent feature of Irish politics. Today, Sinn Féin emerged from what was then a military campaign in the north. But as other comrades have said, it doesn't guarantee their continuance. So I just thought that I would say that in terms of how the split came about in Sinn Féin. Of course, the remnants of the old Sinn Féin became the Workers' Party, Democratic Left, New Agenda, various other names, and they've now disappeared. They joined the Labour Party, amalgamated, and they've gone. As a force in Irish society, they've really gone. They still have some councillors and some influence, but realistically, their influence is gone. Whereas the Provos is now the dominant Sinn Féin type organisation in the country, north and south.
Comrades, any final questions? Anybody want or any comments anybody wants to add before I hand back to Tommy to pull the meeting together? Right, Tommy, you're back on again.
Right. Well, I suppose at this stage, I think maybe to quote old Antonio Gramsci, that whatever pessimism they might have in the mind, we always have to remain optimistic of the heart. Never give up hope that days will be better. I think the discussion has been quite comprehensive, and we've covered all the main points. Politics, as we know, don't ever remain the same. So some pictures are constant, but the political situation can change and change dramatically. And one of the things that we can always count upon with capitalism is there'll be a crisis. And it's at that point that we have got to have the programs and the answers to that crisis. And I think this is where it's imperative that we put pressure on the movement of organised labour to identify the programme and advocate and work for that programme to have it implemented. Programme that I've mentioned here of housing, health, education, workers' rights, if you like, a basic socialist programme. There are issues around reunification, but I think we've got to identify that and, as Kieran has pointed out, discuss how we can address the disaffected within the unionist community. There will be some, but we've got to have a viable sovereign state into which we can merge, or if not, at least have some transitionary phase which will allow the situation to develop peacefully. But we've got to talk about this. We've got to discuss these issues. We've got to have conversation. There's no point putting it off until the very last moment and then hoping that everything will work out on the night. It won't. But I think we've covered most of the issues, most of the topics. And as we've talked about Sinn Féin, the one thing about Sinn Féin is that for a large part in the Republic of Ireland, and here's a point, that a lot of their vote has been working class, people who've wanted to see something different. Now, Sinn Féin will not offer that alternative because they're not going to be any different, really. In the long run, they're opportunistic, they're populist. but there is a significant number of working class people anxious to find an alternative. And I think the responsibility on the left, on the socialist left, is to find and provide and present that a clear alternative. So that's what I'll leave it at that, Jimmy.
Thank you, Tommy. Tommy, I appreciate it, and I appreciate the fact that you're some problems there with your breathing as well, which is for a man who has survived a hunger strike and has lived for a generation after it. It's a tremendous credit to your physical health and your physical energy, as well as your political stamina. Comrades, next week we have a special meeting again. We're discussing trade unionism in America in relation to the presidential elections. And we have two speakers along who are both active trade unionists. Cliff Wilming is a state registered nurse in Minneapolis, and he's going to be given his experience from the Midlands. And Joel Scher is a marine worker who has spent more time on the Pacific rather than he has on Earth or on dry Earth. Joel will be speaking in relation to the activities and understandings on the West Coast ports. And everybody is welcome to that meeting. And as they say in the old show, I'll bring a friend. Roger, do you want to? We normally give the last word to you. Is there anything you wish to add to it?
Well, comrades, I didn't speak in this discussion because I was just so absolutely gripped by the analysis that Tommy made and by the very detailed contributions from other Irish comrades. And I felt that, I could learn a lot more by listening to the comrades than by making what would be really very basic and elementary points. I was going to say, though, that there were comrades here. I think most of them, because of the time difference, would have left by now. But there were comrades here from various parts of India. There were comrades from Cyprus here. There's a comrade still here from Romania. And it struck me that all of the issues we discussed tonight are actually issues in those countries too. In India, the absolutely savage way, the most absolutely brutal and bloodthirsty way in which sectarian and communal divisions have been used in order to stabilize what would otherwise have been a very unstable capitalist regime. And of course, in Cyprus, we had civil war and the partition of the country. And even in Romania, of course, we have the super oppression of the Roma community and the racism which is practiced. And of course, in every country, there's not a single country of where the capitalist class doesn't mercilessly and ruthlessly impose a regime of divide and rule in order to make an attempt to stabilize its rule. And I think actually when Jimmy, you mentioned about the next week, we've got a really important report from trade unionists in the USA. We hear a lot about the USA. We hear a lot about the conflict, so-called, between the different rival capitalist parties. And really, there is no word from a now revived and resurgent trade union movement there, with a new wave of strikes, and also a new. All the elements are there among the youth, particularly, and among the working class, to say that we have to break with both the capitalist parties, who have just minor tactical differences between them, and to break with them and to have a political voice for the working class itself. We saw the Sardis movement, and we saw the strike movement that's developed since. So I just want to appeal to all comrades. There's really, WIN is one of the few groups which still upholds its faith in the unity and the potential power of the working class. We saw in Ireland how most of the left sects just lined up behind the Republican movement, more or less uncritically. And we've seen in most of the countries that I've mentioned, and in many others too, where the same situation has obtained. And I think Wynne plays a particularly important role in upholding the unity of the working class, the common interests of the working class, and without trying to set itself up as a kind of self-appointed, self-styled leadership of the working class, but simply to establish a forum of discussion such as this meeting here and the meetings that we have every week, in order that we can all learn from one another and learn together from the experiences of the working class in order to strengthen and sharpen the internationalist working class response. So I just sort of finish by making those points. Thanks, Jimmy.
Okay, thank you, Roger. With that, comrades, hopefully we'll meet you all again next week and the week after. And I thank everybody for their attendance, Tommy for the work that he put into it for us. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Thanks, Tommy. Okay.
Yes.